So today we're mainly discussing what scale of transport aircraft China will need in the future, at the very least. A few days ago, I watched Kai Genyuan's live stream, where he said Hamas in Gaza is definitely going to lose, and he analyzed many reasons. One crucial point he raised was, who can truly support the people in Gaza? Right now, it seems the whole world can only pay lip service. The real capability to support Gaza isn't about striking Israel, but about airlifting supplies to Gaza. Let's not talk about military supplies for now, just consider basic civilian supplies. For Gaza's population of 2 million, realistically, only the US Air Force might barely be able to accomplish such an airlift globally. But if we consider that the US Air Force's current state isn't optimal, and its transport aircraft readiness rate isn't that high, even the US Air Force might not be able to pull it off. With their current transport fleets, neither China nor Russia could actually complete such a humanitarian relief operation for Gaza. This reminds me of the US airlift support to Israel during the Fourth Middle East War, which was Operation Nickel Grass. The Fourth Middle East War was one of the few where the Arab world initially achieved great victories. Except for the first war where Israel was too weak, we know that in the subsequent wars the Arab countries were beaten from start to finish. But at the beginning of the Fourth Middle East War, Egypt and Syria indeed inflicted significant losses on Israel. For example, in the early stages, Egypt could shoot down 20 to 30 Israeli aircraft per day, and Syria could shoot down over a dozen per day. They also caused very heavy losses to Israel's armored forces. Furthermore, the Fourth Middle East War was the largest in scale among all the Middle East wars. Egypt, Syria, and even including Iraq and Jordan deployed a coalition force to attack Israel. Consequently, Israel not only suffered heavy equipment losses, but most critically, its ammunition was rapidly depleted. For a small country like Israel, their ammunition stockpiles are actually quite limited, and their ability to produce ammunition is also insufficient. At its most critical moment, Israel was down to only 48 hours worth of ammunition. The Israeli Prime Minister at the time then requested assistance from the United States, which ultimately led to Operation Nickel Grass. This operation was fraught with difficulties because, during the Fourth Middle East War, the Arab world was relatively united. They declared an oil embargo against any country supporting Israel. As a result, the whole of Europe dared not support Israel, and even prohibited US Air Force transport aircraft from flying over European airspace, let alone refueling at European bases. Therefore, US transport planes had to fly directly from the US mainland to Israel. At that time, only the US Air Force's C-5 Galaxy transport aircraft barely had the range for such a direct flight. Other transport aircraft did not possess this capability. Relying solely on the C-5 was insufficient for timely replenishment of Israel's ammunition and supplies. So, the US approached Portugal, which reluctantly leased an airbase on one of its islands to the US Air Force, allowing American aircraft to stage from there. The USC 141 Starlifter transports then used this island as a staging point to provide airlift support to Israel. Furthermore, we can see the route taken was very circuitous because it passed over many Muslim countries like Morocco, Algeria, and Libya. Thus, US aircraft carriers provided carrier-based aircraft escort along the route. Flying from Europe would have been much less troublesome, but since Europe denied overflight rights, this supply line became very choosy. Additionally, while the C-5 Galaxy has a maximum payload capacity of 120 tons, because it lacked air-to-air refueling capability at the time, it could only carry about 33 tons of cargo on the direct flight from the US mainland to Israel. One might ask why the C-5 didn't also use the Portuguese airport for staging. This is because every airport has its capacity limit. If both C-5 seconds and Cone 141 seconds used the same airport for staging, the airport's capacity would have been overwhelmed. Therefore, the C-5 seconds flew directly from the US to Israel, while the Cone 141 seconds staged from the Portuguese enclave in the Atlantic. Nevertheless, we can see the formidable capability of the C-5. Although it flew only 25% of the sorties, it carried 48% of the total cargo weight. Moreover, we see that the US airlifted approximately 22,000 tons of military supplies to Israel in total. In reality, the Soviet Union did not stand idly by regarding Syria and Egypt either. Since Egypt and Syria also consumed vast amounts of ammunition in their offensive against Israel, their supplies ran low later in the war. so the Soviet Union also organized a very large-scale airlift. However, the quality of Soviet transport aircraft at that time was actually inferior to that of the US aircraft. The Soviet transports were mainly the An-12, which our Y-8 is a copy of, and the An-22. The An-22 was about a 250-ton aircraft, slightly larger than our Y-20, with a maximum payload of 80 tons. However, the entire Soviet Union only produced about 85 of these aircraft, with roughly 50 serving in the Soviet Air Force and the rest with civilian airlines. Thus, we can see that in terms of transport aircraft tonnage, the US and USSR were not on the same level at all. The Soviet airlift distance was much shorter than the American one, and the number of sorties flown was far higher. US transport aircraft flew less than 600 sorties to deliver 22,000 tons of supplies, while the Soviet aircraft flew a much shorter distance, about 1,700 miles compared to the US's nearly 10,000 kilometers, and delivered only about 16,000 tons. In the end, we know the Fourth Middle East War concluded with Israel's counteroffensive and victory. Although it was a costly victory, winning under such perilous circumstances was quite remarkable. Operation Nickel Grass actually provided a significant lesson for the US Air Force. Originally, their transport aircraft lacked air refueling equipment, as this wasn't a consideration before, but encountering the special historical circumstances with Israel meant that for the C-141 to provide material support, it had to stage through intermediate airports. The C-141 was the predecessor to the US C-17, with a maximum takeoff weight over 150 tons, placing it roughly in the same class as our Y-20 inches terms of tonnage. Here we can see a very distinct feature. This is an early model C-141, while the one in the front is a modified C-141. Notice the bulge on its nose? That was added after Operation Nickel Grass, based on the lessons learned. The US installed probe and drogue, hard air refueling equipment on the C-141, hence the bulge. Similarly, the US C-5 Galaxy initially also lacked air refueling equipment. Of course, because the C-5 is large enough, later additions of air refueling equipment didn't require a prominent bulge like on the C-141. Once equipped for air refueling, if a situation like the Fourth Middle East War were to recur, the C-5 could carry a much larger payload over the long distance, making the transport effort far more efficient. Consequently, aircraft like the C-17 or the later C-141 wouldn't need to rely on borrowing air bases like the one in Portugal, which the US had to expend great effort to secure. This makes me think about a current issue with our country's transport aircraft. I basically haven't seen an air refueling probe on the Y-20. Since the Fourth Middle East War ended with an Israeli victory, the Soviet Union also drew many lessons from it, recognizing the inadequacy of their transport fleet. Subsequently, the USSR undertook a major reform of its transport forces. One key aspect was the mass introduction of the Il-76. Over 900 Il-76 seconds were produced, with the Soviet Air Force operating over 300 during the Cold War. In comparison, the US Air Force fields just over 200 C-17 seconds, and during the Cold War only about 200 Ko-141 seconds. The Soviets also keenly felt the value of very large transport aircraft like the C-5, which led to the development of the An-124 Ruslan. This aircraft is one that many military enthusiasts in our country often talk about longingly. The An-124 first flew in 1982 and entered service with the Soviet military in 1986. Its development was also a profound lesson the Soviets drew from Operation Nickel Grass. To have significant influence overseas, you need a very large-scale transport aircraft fleet. Looking back at the situation during the Fourth Middle East War, Egypt's elite Second and Third Armies were the main forces attacking Israel. The Second Army was defeated but managed to retreat towards Egypt without being encircled. However, the Egyptian Third Army was encircled by Israel. In the end, this unit even depended on Israel for drinking water and food. Israel intended to annihilate this army, as the destruction of such a large formation would severely cripple a nation's army. Therefore, the Soviet Union threatened Israel, stating that if Israel dared to annihilate the Third Army, the State of Israel would cease to exist. The USSR was serious about this. In the latter stages, the Soviets recalled their transport aircraft to the homeland and mobilized 7 airborne divisions. Reportedly, the Soviet plan involved using tactical nuclear strikes first, before airdropping the airborne forces into Israel. US satellites captured images of these 7 assembled Soviet airborne divisions. Ultimately, the US restrained Israel, preventing the complete destruction of the Egyptian Third Army, which subsequently returned to Egypt after the war. The Soviet Union's ability to make such a threat was underpinned by its reasonably sized transport fleet in 1973, which was larger than our country's current transport fleet. Military power is an extension of politics. Nowadays, buying weapons is essentially like paying protection fees. The key question is, in a critical moment of crisis, what kind of assurance can you provide to your allies? Especially in such situations, the reaction time of carriers or ships is far too slow. This is because the initial US proposal to aid Israel via sea lift was immediately rejected by Israel, who said that by the time the ships arrived, their country would already be destroyed. This highlights the need for a very powerful transport aircraft force capable of rapid response. Furthermore, we must remember that the Soviet Union did not share a border with Israel. The fact that the USSR could assemble 7 airborne divisions and convincingly demonstrate the capability to deploy them was a major reason why Israel ultimately stood down. Because for most small countries, regardless of how many weapons they buy, wars ultimately come down to attrition and logistics. Even if a small country can produce some high-tech ammunition, it's often largely assembly-based, and their stockpiles are not vast. The scale, intensity, and sustainable duration of such wars are actually very limited. This includes past conflicts between Pakistan and India, where ceasefires often occurred when both sides ran low on ammunition. For a major power, the emergency support you can provide to an ally in crisis truly demonstrates your capability. You don't necessarily need to commit your own troops to direct combat. Being able to provide timely support itself enhances your political influence. It is under such circumstances that your weapon systems become more marketable. We also saw this in 2022 slip of the tongue, likely referring to the 2022 events in Kazakhstan during the Color Revolution there. The Russian Air Force promptly deployed 70 Il-76 aircraft and 124 aircraft, quickly helping to quell the unrest in Kazakhstan. As we know, our country is a founding member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO. If a similar emergency occurred within an SCO member state, could our rapid reaction forces respond as promptly? Currently, it seems we might still be at a disadvantage compared to Russia. Although Russia's transport aircraft are older and their condition may not be optimal, the Il-76 is fundamentally in the same class as our Y-20. Moreover, Russia possesses the An-124, which we currently lack. As we saw from Operation Nickel Grass, the capability that such heavy transport aircraft bring to rapid reaction is something that Il-76 seconds, Y-20 seconds, or C-17 seconds can never match. This capability is crucial for maintaining an allied regime and preserving the alliance itself. The biggest fear is a color revolution leading to an unfriendly government. For long-range airlift, it's not just about having a large number of transport aircraft. The number of aerial tankers is also extremely important. With sufficient tankers, your transport aircraft can often operate at their maximum payload capacity to support allies. The number of our Y-20-based tanker variants is basically a fraction of other major powers, currently around 20 to 30 aircraft. Furthermore, our Y-20 tanker has a drawback. It itself lacks air refueling capability. This is a conceptual aspect that I believe urgently needs improvement. Tanker aircraft sometimes require long-range relay capability during certain missions. We all know the example from the British-Argentine Falklands War, where the British Vulcan bombers were able to bomb the Falkland Islands. The key factor was that these bombers utilized aerial tankers in a relay refueling fashion, enabling them to reach the Falklands and drop their bombs. Although some argue that we should just focus on managing our own affairs, I believe China's strength must ultimately project outward. As China goes global, direct war between major powers is unlikely. Conflicts are more likely to be proxy wars between smaller allies. In such scenarios, the confidence guarantee you can provide becomes crucial, necessitating a large transport aircraft fleet and a large tanker fleet. Our country has made significant conceptual progress, which is encouraging. We can see, for instance, that the new KJ-3000 heavy airborne early warning and control aircraft already features a refueling probe. In contrast, we know that the KJ-2000 and early KJ-500 models lack this capability. One might argue that the KJ-500 is primarily for territorial air defense, and its 8 to 10 hour endurance is sufficient for that role. But for special missions requiring very long range and duration, it becomes inadequate. Therefore, in recent years, we have seen our country gradually making changes. For instance, the KJ-500 now exists. The KJ-500 Amperes is equipped with an air refueling probe. And even the KJ-200 has added air refueling capability. Of course, I hope that one day the Y-20 will also have air refueling capability. The question is whether a probe and drogue system will be developed for it. If such a hard refueling system is developed, the Y-20 could simply follow the example of the C-141, sporting a bulge on its fuselage to facilitate refueling that would be perfectly acceptable. Furthermore, for our country, the current scale of our transport aircraft fleet is far from sufficient. We all know that our transport force is still organized at the regiment level. Of course, the exact aircraft types and numbers might not be precise here, but we can get a general idea. Currently, our country has roughly 2 regiments of Y-9 seconds, totaling less than 50 aircraft. The Y-9 is roughly equivalent to the C-130 class. We have about 3 regiments of Y-20 seconds, with one of these regiments also including some YY-20 tanker variants. There is also 1 regiment of Il-76 seconds. So even if we consider 4 full regiments of Y-20 seconds, or even if we replace all Y-9 regiments with Y-20 seconds, that would total only about 6 regiments of Y-20 seconds. Calculating at 25 aircraft per regiment, that's only about 150 aircraft, less than 200 large transport aircraft. Moreover, these large transports are only in the 200-ton class, so their lift capacity is far from adequate. Therefore, I personally believe that the scale of our Air Force's transport fleet needs to be expanded by at least 2.5 times. Without even discussing higher numbers, we need a baseline of at least 200 Y-20 seconds. Furthermore, for the future 400-ton class transport aircraft, I believe its production numbers should not be lower than those of the C-5 Galaxy. Our country is currently developing such a 400-ton class large transport. This actually shows that our country is considering these aspects. We shouldn't think that we are only concerned with our own immediate backyard. If we were only focused on that, a 400-ton class aircraft with such a large maximum takeoff weight would be completely unnecessary. It is precisely because you need sufficient international influence and the ability to support key regions that a 400-ton class large transport aircraft is required. In reality, the Y-20 can fulfill most transport tasks for an air force. However, our future tanker fleet needs significant expansion. Our current number of tankers is only a fraction of the US's. Therefore, the scale of our country's future air force is bound to expand further. In fact, we can see that during the Cold War, both the Soviet Union and the United States had transport fleets larger than their fleets of heavy bombers. For battlefield support close to the front lines, medium transport aircraft also have their value. Being smaller than heavy transports, they require less maintenance time in the field and can react more quickly. Our country currently has less than 58 seconds and Y-9 seconds combined. This scale also needs significant expansion. Although our country's conditions differ from those of the US Air Force, I personally believe we need a medium transport force of around 100 aircraft to be truly adequate. The biggest takeaway for me after watching Kai Zhenwan's video is this: you need a transport aircraft fleet of sufficient scale for your voice to carry weight internationally.